This is episode 396 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Philip Schwitzer. I'm the author of Shakespeare and the Remains of Richard III. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When we think of Elizabethan cuisine, we might imagine roasted capons, pies, or tankards of ale. But the humble eel was one of the most ubiquitous and beloved foods in Shakespeare's England. Eels swam through the rivers of London, flavored the dishes of both peasants and nobles, and even featured in laws, literature, and yes, rent payments from Shakespeare's lifetime. In Shakespeare's plays, eels appear both as food and metaphor. They're symbols of slipperiness, secrecy, and sustenance. But what was the actual role of eels in daily life for the 16th and 17th centuries? Where did they come from in the first place? And how were they caught or prepared when somebody wanted to eat one of these? This week, we're joined by Dr. John Wyatt Greenlee, who is a historian, cartographer, and eel enthusiast, to explore the culinary, economic, and cultural significance of eels in the early modern period. He's going to help us understand how eels existed in the world that Shakespeare lived in. John Wyatt Greenlee is a medievalist and cartographic historian, as well as historian of roads and pathways and pilgrimage. He is best known, however, for his public-facing work on eels in pre-modern English history. He's known as the surprised eel historian on social media, where he works to raise awareness of the role of eels as an endangered species. His work on eels and eel history has been profiled in Time magazine, The Guardian, Atlas Obscura, Hakai magazine, and The New Yorker. John Wyatt holds an MPA in nonprofit management from Park University, an MA in history from East Tennessee State University, and a PhD in medieval studies from Cornell University. When he's not tweeting about eels, he draws custom maps and even a few eel portraits on commission. You can find out more about John and his work in the show notes for today's episode. Before we jump into today's conversation, I want to let you know that you can follow along with medieval sketches of eels, museum artifacts about eels, and other insider history extras while you listen to the show by accessing our detailed show notes. You can access these extras from our episode page today at CassidyCash.com/episode 396. Just click Access the Extras to either log in or join us as a patron of That Shakespeare Life, and all the bonus content will expand right on the website. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/episode 396. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, John. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
For those of us that are new to the history of eels, what do they look like? I mean, can you describe them for us? Are they like fish, or are they closer to more like a water snake?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And most people don't actually have a lot of firsthand experience with eels. So it's sort of a question I get a lot. They are a fish. They have scales, although they're really hard to see, but they look a lot like snakes. And it's one of the things that freaks people out about them is that they do, in fact, look a lot like snakes. So the eels that I sort of study historically, there's a bunch of different kinds of eels. So I'm going to back up for a second here. So I'm going to start with the eels that I don't work with, if that's okay. A lot of times when people ask me about the eels, they're thinking about electric eels. Electric eels are not the kind of eels that I work with. Electric eels are not actually an eel. They're a different kind of fish. They're native to South America, so they're not in sort of medieval or Shakespearean England at all. They don't know about electric eels. There are the other kind of eels that people are often most familiar with are moray eels. So these are like flotsam and jetsam from The Little Mermaid, right?
Which are often at like aquariums. I've seen moray eels.
Yeah. So morays, they are marine eels. So they only live in the ocean. They tend to live in reefs. They're really cool. They hunt in packs sometimes, and sometimes they hunt with other fish, which is like collaboratively, which is really cool. And people in sort of pre-modern Europe did in fact eat morays. There's morays in the Mediterranean, so they're really fairly common in like Roman diets and things like that. But they are more of a tropical fish, so they're not really a ton of morays around England. There are a different kind of marine eel. It's called the conger eel. The conger is the biggest eel in the world. They're 6-7 feet long, sometimes up to 300 pounds. They're really big. People in pre-modern England did eat congers, but again, kind of not the eel that I tend to focus on. What I work with in terms of historical research are what are called freshwater eels. And these range from a foot or so up to, sometimes the bigger ones can get up to, in England, can get up to 3-4 feet long. The biggest freshwater eels in the world are in New Zealand, New Zealand longfin, and those can get a little bit bigger still. But they're a really interesting fish. They start their lives in the ocean. They're sort of like river salmon. So they are born at sea and then they migrate to land and live most of their lives in freshwater. And then when they kind of get ready to mate and die, they leave and they go back to sea, probably to all the eels in Europe and the Americas go to the Sargasso Sea, kind of in the middle of the Atlantic. Eels in other parts of the world go to other similar kind of quiet water spots in quiet deep water spots. Those are the eels that I work with. They tend to live in nature. They tend to live sort of somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 years is sort of their normal lifespan. In captivity, they can live substantially longer. There have been eels who lived in captivity up to 60 or 70 years.
This morning, the British Library shared an image trying to get people to sign up for their newsletter, but the image was a mermaid riding what the inscription called a sea serpent. And I almost emailed it to you because I thought, I wonder if this is a type of eel that they're just calling a water serpent. But it sounds like from your description, they are probably depicting, because the mermaid obviously was in the ocean. If the freshwater eel only starts out there at the beginning of its life and the very end of its life, they were probably depicting some of these other eels that you're talking about, the moray or the electric, and not necessarily the freshwater eels that Shakespeare would have been consuming as a food here in Elizabethan England. Yeah.
Probably, I mean, it kind of depends on when the image is from, right? So like medieval monks are notoriously inaccurate in terms of like how they're depicting.
You don't say.
how they're depicting the natural world, because they don't always get out into it. You know, they're in their monastery and they're in their scriptorium and they're like, what does an elephant look like? I don't know. Let's draw something big and weird.
Maybe this, yeah.
Yeah, so now they did know what eels look like, but they also got bored and gave themselves license to do sort of interesting things.
As any good artist should, I think.
Yes, so yeah, absolutely. It's just artistic license is all.
In Henry IV, Falstaff insults a young Hal in a sling of comparisons, but one of the things he includes is calling him an eel skin. What does this insult mean? Why is this comparison considered an effective insult in this situation?
I love that back and forth between the two of them, because Hal is also insulting Falstaff, right? He calls him, I can't remember.
Oh, of course, yes.
Basically a big fat bastard, but in much more sort of fancy Shakespearean terms.
Yes.
He's essentially calling Falstaff fat in most of his things. So Falstaff is calling Hal like really skinny and thin. And so what he's going there with the sort of eelskin references, like and that shows up in a couple of other Shakespeare plays, King John at least, and one other time in Henry IV also, I think, where Falstaff is talking about John of Gaunt defeating somebody he says is so thin that his arms are like stuffed eelskins. So eels are long and narrow. They are they wind up as a metaphor for thinness a lot in a lot of different ways in a lot of different plays in this era. And that's there's two things he's going for. The first is he's looking for metaphors for thinness, but also he's sort of going for metaphors for like dryness. And this gets into humoral theory, but he's stuffed eelskin is going to be sort of dry essentially. And so he's making fun of the prince's vitality as well. He's saying like, you're not as working with humoral theory, you're not as sort of young and juicy as you think you are. You're sort of this, you're dry and the thin husk of a thing. Eels are, like I said, they're long, but they're really very thin. And the other issue there is that eelskin has pre-modern English. They eat a lot of eels, and they created a lot of eelskins in the process. And you can use eelskin for a whole bunch of things. It's really useful for lacing and belting. Even into like the 19th century, they used eelskin for industrial belts because it's really strong. It's sort of naturally thin, like a belt should be. And when it fails sort of along its vertical axis rather than its horizontal. So it like starts to fray and split down the middle rather than just like snapping in half. So that's good for like industrial belting. It has a lot of applications in folk medicine as well. People use it as a wrap for sprained wrists and things, among other things. That's sort of its actual useful folk remedy. But there's also a lot of sort of other applications like grinding it up and snorting it if you have a bloody nose and things like that.
Oh, that sounds horrible.
Yes, it does.
But why does it work?
I don't know. It might actually just sort of act like to help. Like,
just like stuffing,
stuff it up and coagulate.
Yeah,
your nose.
just I don't hold know. Everything in place until like sticking cotton in your nose or something.
Yeah. So there are applications for eel skin, but they're creating way more eel skins than they are actually have use for, and so it's kind of a trash commodity in some respects.
He's essentially just saying you're an old, dried up piece of trash.
Yeah, basically, that's that. Okay. That's a pretty good summation. Yeah.
This next question is submitted by a patron of That Shakespeare Life who wants to know why Don Adriano in Love's Labour's Lost is calling eels ingenious. This play also uses the word quick to describe eels. What was the reputation of eels in this time period? Were they known for being both quick and, I guess, incredibly smart?
Right. I think the ingenious here is not so much dealing with like the eel's intelligence, and eels are not a terribly smart fish, but rather sort of their slipperiness and evasiveness, which is eels are sort of axiomatically slippery. It's the one metaphor that we still have in English for eels is like slippery as an eel. That's a really old metaphor that goes back to the ancient Greeks. It's about as old a metaphor as we have. I think the ingenious is like eels are really hard to get a hold of. You have to grab them sort of. This is also sort of axiomatic. So grabbing an eel by the tail is a metaphor for like doing something the wrong way. If you grab an eel by the tail, it's just going to slip out of your hand and get away. You have to grab it by the head. I think this winds up in a bunch of different metaphors in a bunch of different ways, talking about people being slippery or situations being slippery or sometimes just the eel. So I think in this case, where his servant is sort of saying like, well, you're sort of like an eel. And he says, oh, in that eels are ingenious. And I think he's talking about, maybe he is talking about his own mind, but he's talking about like his sort of the slipperiness and evasiveness and sort of the ability to move in sort of circular and convoluted ways. And then his servant comes back and is like, oh, well, no, in that eels are quick or fast. I think I can't remember, it's one of the two. And there is that as well. They are hard to get a hold of. They can swim backwards, which is interesting. Not all fish can do that, but
I can't think of another fish that swims backwards.
I know that there are some, because at one point I tweeted something about eels being the only fish that could swim backwards, and I had a whole bunch of fish biologists who were like, no, actually, which is like that's actually a really good use of no, actually, because then I learned something. So there are other fish that can swim backwards, but eels are it's not super common, and eels are one of them. So like they are really difficult to get a hold of.
Nothing like social media for the no, actually, but
no, that's true.
Sometimes really useful in a hive mind way. I have to, more than once I have found that to be beneficial. But one of the reasons that these insults are so effective, and especially on stage for an Elizabethan audience, the reason they can say eel-skinned or throw out the slippery as an eel kind of idea is because they were really pervasive in Elizabethan society. And in one of his eel-related projects, John attempted to use historical data to determine the actual monetary value of eels. His project stated that, quote, dried eels were often counted in sticks, and each stick being 25 eels, end quote. But John, share with us, what exactly is the equivalent today of 25 eels on a stick? How much value was in this? If I'm offering you a value of 25 eels, what am I going to get for that?
So there are kind of two different ways to approach this question. One of them is that 25 eels actually today is, in terms of like, if you had 25 eels in your closet back there, and you were coming to me with them, they're actually quite valuable. Eels are endangered species, but they're still a species that people eat a lot of. And so the market for eels is quite robust. So if you had 25 good-sized eels, you could actually, I don't know how much money you could get for them, but you could probably get a substantial amount. That was not quite what I was going for. What I was going for was to get a sense of like how much in that moment is like, what's the value of an eel in that moment? And thinking about that in terms of modern terms, the best equivalent I can come to is that it's helpful to think about eels like hot dogs in a bunch of different ways, actually. So roughly an eel, like one eel is, I worked it out to something like, it was worth something like 33 to 66 cents in today's currency, US currency.
Okay.
Which is roughly a hot dog. They're like hot dogs in other ways too, in that it's a thing that in pre-modern England, just about everybody ate. They were a bigger part of the diet for lower classes because they were cheap and a super useful way of getting fat. They're really a very fatty fish, fat and protein into you. So they're very common. But everybody ate them, from the poorest peasant up to the king. Less commonly as you go along, but all the way through the 1650s, at least, there are English monarchs are ordering large numbers of eels for feasts and things. So it's a fish that everybody eats. It's like hot dogs. Like everybody eats hot dogs at some, or most people eat hot dogs at some point, right? Like even if it's just on the occasion when you go to a baseball game and you have hot dog, like it's a food that sometimes has some cultural relevance. So hot dogs are sort of a useful modern analog for eel in terms of like value, and also to some degree in terms of like sort of social food position.
Well, when we're saying that they ate them like hot dogs, I think everyone now has a mental image of an eel laying across a hot dog bun. So clarify for us, how would they eat them? Did they bake them, fry them, slice them, boil them? What'd they do?
Yes, all of those. I will say too, like you can buy eels like that. Like on the North Sea in Germany, I remember this from when I was a kid. We went up there, that like an eel selling cart with like just dried eels, like lying in little rows. And you pick it up. I don't know if you eat it on a bun, but you can just sort of pick it up and eat it. So they eat eels in a bunch of different ways. So the eels you were talking about a minute ago, the ones counted in sticks, those are usually dried eels, because what they're talking about there is the stick is like 25 eels is about as many eels as you can fit on a stick in a drying shed, essentially. Today, if you buy a dried eel, like a smoked eel, it'll have a really savory, smoky taste to it. That's a more modern smoking process. The medieval smoking process took a lot longer and it's more like drying than smoking. So you wind up with a fish that doesn't have a ton of flavor with it, but it lasts really well. So there's that. But, in Shakespeare's time, the Londoners really preferred live eels. Most people did, honestly, or fresh eels. In Shakespearean London, you would go down to the Thames and most often buy them from the Dutch, who are selling them from ships floating in the middle of the Thames. You buy your live eels and you take them home and cook them and prepare them. So they get cooked in a bunch of different ways. They get sort of cut up into rounds and cooked in a pan. They get put into soups and stews. They get put into pies, which is there's a mention in King Lear about eel pies and getting it wrong. And the King Lear joke, the cook forgets to kill the eels before she puts them in a pie. And it's a joke that's working on a bunch of levels because it's also a sort of a phallic joke. But part of the reason that the joke works is the fool is, King Lear's fool is talking to him about this cook, and she forgets to kill the eels, and they sort of pop up as she's trying to cook the pie. And it works because everybody in the audience knows like how you make an eel pie, man. You got to kill the eels first.
So if they're popping up, you really don't know what you're doing.
It's a marker of sort of obvious stupidity for the audience. And it falls a little bit flat with modern audiences because we're like, I don't know. I mean, sure, it makes sense to kill them before you put them in a pie, but like, who's eating eel pie anyway? But for Shakespeare's audience, that would have clicked for them. They were like, oh, yeah, wow, she is an idiot.
Yeah, I mean, this is something they might have like eaten the night before they came to the play the next day, or even so. Very relatable. Well, now you're mentioning that they are on the same level as hot dogs, and I don't want to downplay the value of eels, because it was John's research where I learned about people were once actually paying their rent in eels. So, John, based on this value of eels, exactly how many eels did you need to be able to pay your rent with them? So
that really varied. Eel rents is a bit of an earlier medieval phenomenon. By the time you get to the 1600s, there are only a handful of eel rents left in England. They're really common in England through about the Black Death. Sort of in pre-Norman England or early Norman England, there's not a lot of hard currency floating around. And what there is not equally distributed. It tends to stay and circulate among the wealthy, who sort of trade it back and forth, sometimes as like what's essentially a gift economy. So it's not really used for buying a lot of things, which means that if you are a landlord, your tenant doesn't have money to pay you. So you got to take your payment in something else. Otherwise, like, what's the point of being a landlord, right? So pre-Norman and early Norman England, there's a lot of in-kind rents where people are paying their rent to their landlord in butter or eggs or ale or grain or eels. And eels are one of the most common in-kind rents in the Doomsday Book. They're more common than grain. So part of my sort of historical research was trying to count up all of the eels that I could find in rent, which took me several years because there's not like a centralized database or anything. It's just a lot of like,
you're just going line by line and making
through
tallies.
Different charters, and this number is low. but the number that I can sort of I can attest to is about 540,000 eels a year were being paid in England in like 1100, or at least they were due. There's sometimes a difference between taxes that are due and taxes that are paid. That's actually one of the ways that I know about some of the eel rents, because sometimes there won't be an initial charter, but a landlord will sue a tenant for back on a rent. You're like, oh, I didn't know that rent was there, but now I do. Yeah, in 1100, there were about 540,000 eels that were due in taxes in England every year. There are some sort of blank spaces in that I know about. This doesn't really include the northern part of England. It doesn't include the area around London, where I know there were taxes and eels for various properties, but London's not counted in the Doomsday Book. And
so while they're like monetary conversion value of, the one eel equals approximately 40 cents may not be very high, the sheer volume at which they were being used and being found valuable is why they were able to be traded for high value goods like the rent on a property.
Yes. And so most in-kind rents sort of disappear over the course of the 12th century. Eel rents don't, though. Eel rents stay pretty popular through about the Black Death, at which point roughly half the population dies, which, among other things, essentially doubles the available monetary supply, right? So like suddenly everybody's got about twice as much money, like hard currency, and landlords start expecting their rent much more often that's where you see the real drop-off in eel rents is right around the Black Death. There's a couple of reasons why they're really popular, though. They are almost always paid in dried, salted, and smoked eels in sticks, so 25 eels in a stick, and then sometimes counted in what are called bines, which is 10 sticks, so 250 eels. And some of the rents are really small, 50, 75 eels for a year, and some of them are really big. The largest eel rent that I know of is from the Doomsday Book, and it was owed to the Earl of Chester from the town of Harmston owed the Earl of Chester 75,000 eels every year, which is substantial.
Yes, I mean, that's like a fourth of the 500,000 eels you said were collected in the 1100s.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a huge amount.
It's a really big number. As time goes on, most of the landlords who continue to collect eels as rent are monastic, and they're generally collecting them right before Lent. Most of the time, the eel rents are due sort of early spring, so before Lent, because Lent is a period where you're not supposed to eat meat, you're just supposed to eat fish. Eels are a fish, which is good.
So it fulfills that requirement. They're stocking up.
They are, and they're actually even better than some fish, because the medieval conception of eels is that they're an asexual fish, that they reproduce asexually, because I said earlier, eels are mate, die, and are born out at sea, and they come to shores like these little things called elvers, little baby eels. So nobody, to this point, actually, still today, nobody has seen eels reproduce in the wild. And the medieval conception of eels, dating all the way back to Aristotle, essentially, is that they somehow reproduce asexually. They have some sort of spontaneous generation that just like produces more eels, which is great because during Lent, you're not supposed to think about sex at all. And Thomas Aquinas talks about how like one of the reasons we don't eat meat during Lent is because like you can go out in a field and watch cows having sex. And so like eating beef makes you think about cows having sex. And like, that's not good.
I got to say, that hasn't been my experience.
No, it hasn't been my experience either. And it makes me wonder a little bit about our friend
We're
Tom.
We're a little worried about Thomas there, but
yeah,
okay.
but that's but he says fish are better because you don't actually see fish having sex so much. And by that logic, you extend that logic. You say, well, eels are even in fact better than that because
they're a less scandalous option for your dinner. Yes,
they are. And what's really fascinating to me about that is there are two tracks of thought about eels in this, because that's the sort of theological, like the thinking man's approach to eels, right? It's like, I've read my Aristotle and I know they don't have sex. All right. But the parallel sort of cultural track is that eels look a lot like penises, man, and they're great stand-ins.
That was in the back of my mind because the King Lear joke plays on that. So
it does. The eels pop up and she's down. It's absolutely a phallic joke that he's making there with the eels, and they show up that way in Elizabethan era plays all the time.
I feel like I should apologize to my classroom teachers that are playing this in their study of King Lear, and we have caused them to erupt into abject pandemonium. But
sorry about that. No. But it's a really fascinating duality to me that like the eels have sort of along this theological track that's sort of very like they're an asexual fish, and so they're great for this, but also a complementary cultural track that's going like, no,
which is it's very
they're
Elizabethan.
amazing metaphors for paralysis. They're just great.
It's very Elizabethan to take something that was supposed to be pure and holy and totally take it the other direction. If you think just hearing John Wyatt Greenlee talk about eels is fantastic, wait until you see the bestiary illustrations, 16th century maps, woodcuts, and paintings that have been packed into the research vault for today's show. Dive right in as a member of that Shakespeare Society. Visit CassidyCash.com/episode 396 and click Access the Extras to explore all the bonus content straight from John Wyatt Greenlee himself, as well as research I put into today's show, all while you listen. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/episode 396. But despite their reputation of duality here, eels weren't just a local staple when it came to cuisine or ways to pay your landlord. They played a really large role in the broader English economy, which you might have anticipated in the sheer numbers being owed and paid here that we've talked about. But John, tell us about the scale of London's eel trade. Where were the eels coming from? I mean, were they catching all of these numbers in the Thames, or were they actually being brought into the city from somewhere else? And what does the eel trade tell us about their economic importance for Shakespeare's England?
London grows relatively fast after the Black Death, and pretty quickly outstrips its ability to feed itself eels from the Thames and the Medway and other local streams. And so relatively quickly, London begins to rely on imported eels to sort of subsidize its eel habit. And some of these are coming from the Fens, from East Anglia, from the Norfolk Broads, from places like that. And they're being brought in carts and wagons and smaller amounts on horseback and things like that. And some of those are dried and smoked, and some of them are live. You can transport eels alive in like a barrel and keep them alive for a little bit of time. Not in water, because if you put them in water in a barrel, they exhaust the oxygen pretty quickly, but they can live out of water for a while.
Well, you mentioned that they start out in the ocean and come up on land and then return to freshwater. So do they actually breathe air within some kind of limited capacity?
So they do. They're born at sea and they come inland. So they are
not on land, just to the coast.
Right.
Gotcha.
Okay. And sort of they live in streams and lakes and ponds and things. They can, however, travel out of water. Like if the pond that they're in starts to dry up, they can pack up and leave and go to another stream. They can travel overland
for short distances when necessity demands. Yes.
And they'll do it, especially if the conditions are right, if it's been wet, if the grass is wet, because that's what they need. They need some sort of moisture around them. So like you can pack them in a barrel between layers of wet moss or hay, and they can stay alive for several days. And so they can travel out of water for several days. One of the experiences that people have who keep eels as pets in aquariums is that they will very often knock the lid off and climb their way out. And then you have to like try to find your eel because it's somewhere in the room.
And here's where the ingenious reputation comes from.
That might be true too. Yeah. Some of this trade is coming from sort of inland, sort of overland trade from the Fens, from the Norfolk Broads, from places like that. And that continues even in the 19th century. There's a source I found talking about how a good season in the eel trade for a fisherman on the Broads would basically pay for them for the year. Like that subsidizes their year. So if they have a good season with eels, then they're good for the year. Everything else is kind of gravy. The number of eels you can bring in by wagon load is insufficient. Live eels by wagon load is sort of insufficient for the growing population of London. And so they start increasingly buying eels from the Dutch, which I mentioned a little bit ago. So in the late 14th century, the Dutch start substantial trade in eels to London, among other places in Europe. So one of the things that happens in the Low Countries during the Black Death, in most places in Europe, the Black Death sees a flight from cities. People like freak out in the cities, like it's too crowded, too many people going out to the country. But in the Low Countries, it goes the other way. People flee from the country into the cities. You have a big growth of cities, and a lot of the properties in the countryside fall into disrepair, and they get bought up by a handful of merchant families in some of the bigger cities. And so these families in Amsterdam and some other places wind up in control of a substantial series of locks and lakes and dams and canals. And this also means that they wind up in control of a huge supply of eels. the Low Countries are sort of famously really good habitat for eels. So they start selling them because they're merchant families. It's what they do. They start selling them in other places, London being one of the primary places. And initially they're selling them mostly as dried eels, so in barrels, bring them across. But starting in the mid 15th century, so 1450, 1470, something like that, they start bringing them across the English Channel in the holds of well ships, basically. So these are the best thing to think of it as like kind of a floating aquarium. So the hold of the ship is mostly full of water. It's got some holes on the side to allow for water flow in and out for oxygenation, and it's sort of filled up with eels. So they would bring these across and park them on the Thames, in the middle of the Thames. They've got some water flow through them. And then you take a small boat out to one of these eel ships. They drop a bucket basically into the hole and pull up your eels, weigh them for you, you buy them, and off you go.
It's an early modern food truck for eels.
Yes.
I love this.
Pretty much exactly what it is. The Dutch are the only people that know how to make these ships. It's called a water ship or a water boat. In this period, it's a specifically Dutch thing. It's a bit of a point of national pride, these ships. And they use them for a lot of inland trade on canals, but also here for bringing eels all the way across. And we know that nobody else knows how to make these because there's a point in the mid 17th century where the King of England, Charles II, wants to have his fish provider get more eels for him, and the guy has to get permission from Parliament to go over to the Low Countries to buy two of these ships because he says nobody in England knows how to make these at all. It's just the Dutch that know how to make them. And so what this means is that the Dutch are essentially the only people who have the capacity to trade in live eels in bulk, and they pretty quickly develop a de facto monopoly on eel sales in the city. I mean, there are still people bringing in eels from the country and from a bunch of other places, but the Dutch, it becomes sort of a byword. Dutch eels become sort of a way of saying it's a Dutch eel. It's sort of a way of saying it's a really good eel. By the time you get to about 1600 or so, they've pretty much consolidated the trade here enough that, and this is how I actually got interested in eels, but that these ships start showing up on maps of London, parked on the Thames, these labeled eel ships. I got interested in it because I was looking at maps of London for something really different, and I didn't know anything at all about eels. So the eels caught my eye, but also the fact that everything else on these maps that is a label is either a neighborhood or a really big civic monument, like St. Paul's or the Globe or something like that, something that can't leave. And then you have these two ships in the middle of the Thames that are labeled, and but they can sail away. So that's as a historian,
that's a huge indicator, of
as a historian, it's the sort of thing that you notice and you're like, why? Yes, why?
There's a story here, is what we say. Yes,
there was a much longer story than I thought. I was trying to write a 25-page paper, and I wound up writing a dissertation. Yeah, so the Dutch began bringing over these eel ships. They park them on the Thames. They become essentially a civic landmark, and they get kicked off the Thames between 1666 and 1681, so about 15 years. So right in the middle of the Anglo-Dutch Wars, when the English are trying, they try to sort of encourage a homegrown eel economy. They want to encourage the English people to raise more eels and sell more eels. And at some point, in 1680, there's a couple of anonymous petitions to the Parliament. There's man, it's not working, and we really want our eels.
Give this up. We want the good stuff back, please.
Yeah.
Thanks.
This is compounded by the fact that in this period, the English are draining the fens in East Anglia, which is one of the island's premier eel habitats. And so they're sort of destroying one of the spaces where they could get eels natively anyway. Yeah, so the Dutch get allowed back onto the Thames, and they stay there selling eels from these ships until 1938.
That is a fantastic amount of time.
It really is. And more or less, the ships are unchanged. So there are Charles Pathet, I'm never sure how to pronounce it, but did a black and white silent movie of these things. You can look it up on YouTube. There's black and white pictures of them from the 30s, and they look more or less identical to some of the drawings on some of the maps, on Holler's maps from 1647. They've put an engine in the thing, but otherwise they're using the same ship, parking in the same place, selling eels pretty much exactly the same way. It's one of the things I love about this story is there aren't a whole lot of certifiably medieval things that continue on into the modern, and this is definitely one of them.
John shares images of these Dutch ships harvesting and distributing eels, as well as documentation about exactly how many were being delivered, all on his Twitter page. And we've included both paintings of this and links to John's Twitter account in the extras for this week's show, so you can find the episode URL for that later in the conversation, but definitely go there to see more of this. John writes that in classical antiquity, people used eels to kill their enemies by tossing them into eel-filled ponds. If eels were really that dangerous, John, how were people catching them? And what did eel catching actually look like?
That's sort of a one-off story about a Roman aristocrat who enjoyed throwing people into a pond full of, well, possibly eels and possibly lampreys, or possibly moray. So this is one of the really interesting, for me at least, interesting and complicated things about trying to suss out exactly what eels look like in history. Is the Latin word murena has three distinct meanings, and it can mean moray eel, it can mean lamprey, and it can mean freshwater eel. And it gets used interchangeably, sometimes within the same passage. And so it becomes a question of sorting out context to figure out what kind of eel we're talking about. So this particular story about this Roman aristocrat, he has a servant who annoys him thrown into this pool of murenae. So this gets translated sometimes as lampreys and sometimes as eels and sometimes freshwater eels and sometimes moray eels. My guess is it's probably moray eels. So lamprey sometimes get confused with eels. They're a very different fish. They're a more primitive fish. They don't have a jaw. They've just got this sort of circular mouth with all these teeth, right? They're very scary looking, but it would take a lot to get killed by even a whole bunch of lamprey. And freshwater eels, they're carnivorous. They will eat all sorts of things, including other eels. It would take a lot also for them to attack and eat a person. Moray eels are your best bet. They're a little bit more vicious. They have sort of stronger, bigger teeth and are much more likely to attack somebody. There's a whole bunch of reports of morays actually attacking people. So that's my best guess. So they're not especially dangerous freshwater eels.
So even the lampreys, which are the ones I've been thinking of when we were talking about eels, and I think you've just distinguished for us that those are actually two different things. There's a lamprey eel, and then there's freshwater eels.
Yep.
So, but the lampreys are terrifying to look at.
Yes, they are. They are. So the lampreys, they're their own fish. They're not eels at all. They have a life cycle a lot like salmon. They're born in freshwater and then spend most of their lives at sea, actually. They are, in fact, terrifying, I think. I know some people who think they're cute.
Well, to each their own.
I disagree, but they can go their own way, and that's fine. Yeah.
That's fine. Well, John, you've uncovered so many fascinating stories from your research about eels, and we, believe it or not, we have only scratched the surface of the history of eels here in our conversation today. But I want to ask whether or not there's a detail or surprising fact about eels in Shakespeare's England that we haven't touched on in today's conversation, but that you think our listeners might really enjoy.
So one of the things that's really fascinating to me, and hopefully to your listeners as well, is that I mentioned that the Dutch are sort of the primary sellers of live eels in London in sort of Shakespeare's period and a little bit after, and that they get kicked off the Thames for about 15 years in the mid-17th century. But leading up to that, as sort of tensions ratchet up between the Dutch and the English over the early part of the 17th century, there is increasing tension, and you can see it in how the Dutch and the eels are talked about in plays. There's increasing tension in London about the fact that the Dutch are selling what the English tend to think of as sort of a national symbol in some ways. It always gets tricky talking about nationalism in pre-modern anything, but to the extent that you can, it's one of the arguments that I made in my doctoral dissertation is that pre-modern England has sort of an eel culture, and sort of identifies the pre-modern English identify themselves as a people who eat eels. It shows up in a whole bunch of ways. It is one of the ways that they think about themselves, that this is who we are. We're an eel people. And I think it becomes increasingly contentious for them that in their national capital, this sort of essentially national food is being primarily sold by a group of people who are becoming increasingly their direct sort of national competition. So the way that the Dutch ships get talked about in several of Beaumont and Fletcher's plays in the first sort of in the first quarter or so of the 17th century, it becomes increasingly concerned and almost militaristic in the way that they're describing the ships and the captains. And by the end of this period, they're starting to describe these Dutch eel ships in terms of an invading force, where 25 years earlier, they were not. They were talking about them as maybe a little bit silly in some ways. And so that you can see the sort of eels getting wrapped up in this sort of early nationalist colonial contest that's starting to ratchet up between the Dutch and the English. And it's just a small way. And it's, one of the, I think eels are fascinating and they're a really interesting part of history, English history. Learning about them helps really sort of flesh out a lot, but it's also a really small part of what's going on in all sorts of ways. But this is a way that you can look at the way that eels and the eel ships especially are talked about in the plays during this period, and you can see tension sort of increasing over the course of the period.
If someone wanted to keep exploring this subject on their own, and there's a ton to explore, obviously the first place we're going to send you is to the Surprised Eel Historian on Twitter. But beyond following you on Twitter, John, what can you recommend that we start with if we're ready to dive into the history of eels and want to learn more?
Yeah, my doctoral dissertation, if you're interested, is available online. And that is probably the single best place for a concise history, and concise is relative, concise history of eels in England.
John was really helpful and sent us over a nice list of resources for you for places that you can start. And I'm not even covering the extent to which following him on Twitter is so much worth your time if you're interested in exploring this history. So we will place links to all of these resources in the show notes for today's episode. You can go there and find direct links to books, websites, and other resources if you'd like to explore the history of eels further. Now, John, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Oh, boy. I might have to pick a Terry Pratchett book, honestly.
Oh, there you go. That would have you well set up, I think.
Yeah, but then I have to pick which Terry Pratchett book.
True. You have to narrow it down.
I do. I love some of the Sam Vine books. I really love Small Gods. Maybe Guards. Yeah, I'll go with Guards. I feel like that's among other things, I feel like that's sort of Pratchett at the height of his powers.
There you go. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
A couple different things. So I am very slowly trying to take my dissertation and turn it into a book that people would actually read, which is its own special sort of process. It's really hard to take a project that you've spent 10 years sort of building and then sort of pull it all apart and redo it, which is kind of what you have to do to make an academic work actually interesting for normal people or other academics for that matter. So there's that. The other thing right now that I mostly do is I am not in academia currently. I draw maps for a living, maps and artwork. So that's always sort of its own continuing adventure in a way. I primarily do maps for historical books and monographs, which means that I'm always learning a little bit about other people's research, which is fun for me. And then I sort of work with people to draw the maps for their books. But then I don't actually have to write the book. I just learn about their research a little bit, draw the map, and I move on. So I've been doing that, and I've been sort of recently expanding into doing artwork on commission as well. I do a lot of sort of black and white kind of abstract line drawing stuff that's kind of fun. So that's kind of what I'm doing with myself.
I was drawn to your work and connecting with you because of the history of eels you post on Twitter, but I am a historical map illustrator myself, although I do more building portraits and sort of talking about places than some of the gaming type maps and work that you do. But I loved your work into maps. So I think the history that you share there is really exciting as well. So we will place links to John's work where you can see his maps and see his work into eels. And I know of no one else who could share as extensive research that's not only informative and rooted in strong history, but it's just outright fun. I've had a blast learning about the history of eels, and I'm honored that you took time to speak with us today and share this history with us. Thank you, John Wyatt Greenlee, for being here. It's been fun talking with you.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
As we close our eel field expedition through the rivers and recipes of early modern England, we're reminded that even the slipperiest parts of history have a place in Shakespeare's world. Thanks so much to John Wyatt Greenlee for guiding us through the muddy and marvelous story of the eel, a creature that once fed a nation, paid its rent, and found itself immortalized by Shakespeare's plays. Remember that you can find extras about the eel, many shared with us just for you by John Wyatt Greenlee this week, including 16th century paintings, woodcuts, so much more. This is all packed into the detailed show notes for patrons this week. Log in at castycash.com/episode 396 to access these insider extras. Just a quick reminder here, if you are interested in learning how to cook eels yourself, if you would like to dive in and give this a try using recipes from Shakespeare's lifetime, be sure to check out Experience Shakespeare on Patreon. This is our tier where we go even further into the history of William Shakespeare by offering you hands-on activity kits that let you try out some of the history you're learning about here on the show. In the case of today's episode, what we're helping you explore is how to prepare an eel at home. These activities are designed to be completed in your home or classroom with items you may already have at your market or store. And yes, we do tell you how to source an eel for this activity. Learn more and sign up today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife or by visiting the Access the Extras link in our show notes. That Shakespeare Life is written and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. Until next time, may your nets be full, your rivers clean, and your eels always plentiful enough to pay the landlord. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.